Alrighty, we're live. So we're going to be continuing our React series today. We got part 3, focusing on loading data from an API and then dynamic rendering. We kind of got into some of that dynamic rendering last time when we were playing around with rendering, like in this case, 3 different paragraph components based on this content array that we held on state. So what we're going to be doing today is refactoring this to be more realistic, like actually making a request to an API with fetch, getting that data back, setting it on state, and then rendering based on that data being available. So we'll be doing some stuff that may be familiar from last time, but we're adding in now actually interfacing with an API, adding some lifecycle methods in here. But let's check out the objectives. So first one, by the end of this lesson, you'll be able to load data from an API with fetch. I think everyone has used fetch at this point, right? Cool. We'll use list components to dynamically render content. So we did, as I mentioned, sort of a simplified or a little bit of a contrived example of that at the end last time, where we got these paragraphs dynamically showing up. Oh, I don't have the app running yet. If you don't have your app running, go ahead and run npm start in your app folder so that we can get it going. And then we'll take another look at our objectives. So we'll use list components to render single components that are handling just small pieces of our overall state of our application. And then I mentioned at the end of last time that we're going to push some of this discussion or a deeper discussion of component hierarchy and architecture till today. So once we add in a couple more components, we'll have a little bit more going on. We'll have data loading from an actual API, and then we can really talk a little bit more about the architecture. Got some resources here. We'll take some notes as we go. And actually, what I'd like you to do as we're getting started here, go ahead and open up this first article that I've sent here, this adding lifecycle methods. So this is coming from the React documentation, which, as I've said, is pretty good. And we need to, we'll talk more about lifecycle methods and how many there are and why you use them. But the bottom line with lifecycle methods is that a component has sort of like a lifetime, right? It gets created, it gets sort of hooked into the DOM, and then it gets destroyed if new data, and re-rendered, right? If the data changes, React does all this work for us under the hood, and there are certain methods or so certain functions that get called at various parts of this lifecycle. So there's a lifecycle hook that gets called when the component's about to be created, when it gets created and loaded into the DOM, when it's getting destroyed. There's a whole bunch of them. You only really need to focus on a couple. And really one is our most important one. So let's do a few minutes to read. Start in this section, adding lifecycle methods to a class, because we're going to do this to our app.js class component. You can kind of ignore some of the timer stuff. Focus on this like special methods part. And I'd like you to read. Really just read this first section where they're talking about like componentDidMount and this component will unmount. Don't worry too much about this once it gets into using set state, because we're going to talk a little bit more about that going forward. So let's do like 3 minutes to read and to ponder, and then we'll have some discussion on what's going on with these lifecycle methods. if you reach this section that talks about using state correctly, you've gone too far. Don't go into that section because we'll do a little reading on that in a bit. So we're focusing on what are these lifecycle methods, why do we need them, why do we care about them. About a minute left on the timer. Should I add a little more time, or do you think a minute's going to be good? All right, cool. Another 30 seconds or so. All right, looks like we're at time here, and we didn't have horrific beeping, so that's nice. So let's just talk together a little bit about these lifecycle methods or lifecycle hooks. You'll hear them referred to as hooks a lot. Guys, take a volunteer on like what did this section? What can you glean from this section about specifically about these? They're talking about this component did mount. What is component did mount? Why do we need it? Yeah.
So what I am understanding is that React has certain methods that are required for rendering certain things and doing something with the data when we were rendering it, and vice versa. When we were rendering something new, we need to do something with the old data, and so that's what these methods are in place for.
Cool. So certain methods that are called at, let's say, various times in a component's life. And like these components live many lives over the course of our application because they're getting, anytime data changes, if that component is now receiving some different props, then that component is actually re-rendering and oftentimes going through some of these lifecycle methods.
And these are automatically called if they exist.
Yeah, nice, good note. Automatically called if they exist in your component. Any other thoughts? Maybe why do we care? Why do we need to think about this now in the context of, say, loading data from an API or making a fetch request? Think about that for a minute or for 10 seconds or so. What's the relationship perhaps between these lifecycle methods and us needing to get some data, basically? Yeah, Danny.
Well, if you're rendering your page and then you want to take some information from an API and put it on that page, the page is going to have to be there before you put anything on it.
Nice. Yeah, page is going to have to be there. So like trying to figure out when and where can we actually start initiating a request for some data. One of these lifecycle hooks probably makes sense. Definitely makes sense. Yeah, yes. Here, let's say load data from API with fetch. These notes will kind of fall under this. We use these lifecycle hooks. Let's say we need a place to fire off asynchronous. Oh boy. Cronus. requests, and in this particular case, you check the docs. The first one that they talk about here, componentDidMount, this is our go-to for fetch requests and initiating this asynchronous behavior, and kind of getting our app actually going and flowing with some dynamic data. So let's just make a note of that. ComponentDidMount, whoops, is the place for fetching. Cool. So let's see it in action. Let's do it. We'll go back to app.js, and because right now we have some content, but again, it's not dynamic. We made it so that our components themselves are a lot smarter, but we still have hard-coded data. Ultimately, what we want is for when this app loads up, when our app.js component mounts, so when it starts to exist in the DOM, let's send off this request, let's get some data, and then let's put that on state. So I'm going to modify state a little bit here, and we're going to be working with an API today. Question? Oh, Zoom? Yeah. Absolutely. Here, I'm going to get rid of the folder structure here. We're going to be working with a small API that I built that is like a collection of GIFs. So I'm going to identify on our initial state that we're going to have some GIFs. They're not available yet, but it's a good practice to sort of let yourself and any other developers know what is going to exist on state. So we're going to be making a request to an API. It's going to come back with an array of objects that have info about GIFs. And so we'll just initialize this as an empty array. So now we need our lifecycle method. We need a place to make the request. So you can start typing, and in fact, if you're using VS Code, it'll autocomplete for you. ComponentDidMount. We can see that there's a bunch of other ones here. Component will unmount, component will update. There's also component will mount. They've even noted unsafe. I used to do my fetch request in will mount, and I learned that it's actually not a bad practice. We want to make sure the component exists before we load anything into it. So we'll do componentDidMount. There we go. It's a function. It's a method, so it's a function. Method is just a function attached to an object or a class in this case. And now we can initiate our fetch request. So I think I slacked out this API URL. It's also in the README on master, I believe. If we check Denver students, I think I slacked it. Let's check it out. Yeah, right at the bottom of what I slacked with the objectives. That has the URL. So you can copy it right from there. And I'm just going to go ahead, for right now, I'm just going to declare a constant outside the class and call it API URL. I'll just capitalize those. Equals this string. This is where we're going to request data from. So, yeah, question.
It just seems to me like intuitively that you would want to get your data before you mount. Since didMount was called after a first render, you're going to have a lot of conditional rendering because it's going to render with no data first.
Right.
What's the negative?
I agree. I think it's more intuitive. The negative is that it's possible that your data comes back before it actually does mount, and then you're in this weird situation where you're in this in-between place where this component is coming into existence and you're trying to like modify it, because usually we'll set state after this fetch request. I hadn't actually personally run into issues doing it that way, but our very own Dan Levy informed me that that's not a good practice. You are going to create a first render without data, though.
Do you have access to state in will mount?
Yeah, you can call like a set state function there. But roll with didMount. It's safer. It's safer. It'll probably work if you did will mount, but this is safer basically. So we need to make a fetch request. Help me write this fetch request. What do we need to start with? Fetch. And then what are we fetching to? API URL right there. API URL. No, I capitalized everything. And then, yep, response. We'll use our fat arrows for an implicit return. Cool. We'll return response.json, right? So now in this second .then block, we will have a function that actually has some meaningful data. Sometimes I call it data here. In this case, I know that I'm requesting a bunch of GIFs, so I'm just going to do GIFs. Actually, I'll tell you what. First, well, yeah, we'll do GIFs. They are GIFs, I promise. And let's open up a block here, and let's just log the GIFs. Just log those out. Take it slow. Make sure that this fetch is working right so far. And let's find where the app is running. Here it is. I'm going to close these out. Cool. So let's open up the dev tools. And we see from line 24, which is where this log is coming from, we now have an array of GIF objects. They're really simple. Figured I'd keep this API clean for right now. So each object in the array simply has a description and a GIF URL. And that just takes you right to an isolated version of the GIF. So we can use this in our app. And our goal is to ultimately get to a point where we have basically all these GIFs rendering out on the page dynamically. Sweet. So this seems to be going well so far. Our app is loading up. We're making our requests to the API. Data's coming back. We have the data. Now what the heck do we do with it? So we've talked about state a decent amount now. And you don't have to read this right now, but I want to point you to this section on using state correctly. I think that this is sort of the section that you were bumping up against. This is the key thing right here. I'm going to zoom this in. Whoa. Do not modify state directly. This is sort of just a rule in React. We don't access state and try and change it directly. So if we have an array on state, you don't push into state. The way to handle making changes to state in React is using this setState function. Can we zoom that a little bit? Yeah. So, and you see they have an example right here. You don't access state directly and change its values. What you do is you call setState and you pass it an object, right? Because state is an object anyways. We pass it an object that we basically want to be merged into the current state. You may see some patterns where people make entire copies of state and then merge it with like the spread operator or object.assign. You don't actually have to do that. And if this property already exists on state, it will just be overridden. If it doesn't exist at all, it will now exist. So I think the syntax can look like a little weird, but all it is a function, or setState is a method. It's a method that we've inherited by extending our base class. It's one of the things that came from the React component that we're extending right here. And all we have to do is pass it an object. That's it. So if we want to get our GIFs actually onto state, instead of logging them, right? Logging them is great for debugging and making sure we know what we have. But what we really want to do, and what you're most likely going to want to do in almost all of your applications, when you do an initial load, you make a fetch request, and then you set the results on state. So let's write the function together, or write the method together. So we call this.setState. It's a method, so we invoke it, and then just declare an object in there. I like to break it onto a new line for readability. And what do we want to set on state? We want to set these GIFs that came back from the API, and we want to set the GIFs key equal to that result. So we do GIFs as the key, and then we do GIFs as the value, right? So this GIFs is referring to this key, and this GIFs is referring to what came back from the API. So you could call this data if it's more clear to you. That will work. I think I'll leave it like that for right now to differentiate. So we're passing the setState function an object. It's going to merge it into our existing state. I think they mentioned somewhere, yeah, state updates may be asynchronous. So there's a temptation, and I used to do this a lot when I was first working with React, to set state and then log this.state right afterwards. But This is most likely not going to work. Let's put a little label on this, state, and go back to our app. Also, Michael has pointed out React has really good developer tools. It's a Chrome extension. I'm not going to use that today, but for next time, I might send out some instructions on getting that installed. It gives you some nice handy ways to see your state, see props, kind of navigate through your app. Let's see. So the app loaded. We got our, oh, the GIFs actually got in there. So nice. So as it said in the docs, set state may be asynchronous. So in this case, the data got set quickly enough that our log ran. You may run into situations where you're not seeing the latest state there, and you're like, what the heck happened? I just set state. Why is it showing me stuff from the previous state? I just want to point that out, that you may not see things right after they're set.
Does that have to do with JavaScript hoisting and console.log command that requires this?
It's not so much hoisting, but it's actually, so it's code normally runs top to bottom, right? That's synchronous. So what happens with asynchronous things, like fetching data, but also in this case setting state, is that the line right below may run. So this initiates an asynchronous action. This line, because it's right below, may run before set state is kind of finished doing its thing. Yeah, cool. Any questions on getting data and then setting it on state? Because this is crucial. All right, cool. We'll move on.
Is there any issue with changing data types when you set state? Using GIFs later for a non-array versus an array?
Not technically, because JavaScript is so loosey-goosey in general about types. You could, like if we initialize GIFs as an empty string, like it's not going to break our code. We'll do a hard refresh. They still should be getting in there on state.
It's bad practice because you're assuming it's going to be an array later or a string later.
Yeah, exactly. It's essentially like intentionally confusing yourself or someone else. And you actually don't even need to set an initial value on state. We could leave this completely empty. But then it's really hard to figure out what should become available on state. So again, it's really just like best practice. There will be GIFs available in this component. So we just initialize it as an empty array. But yeah, Jeff.
So far, we're only, you said when we do like a set statement, pass it a object, we're only adding things. So if we,
Yes.
we can repeat that. We can do like pictures, we can do like phrases, and we're just going to keep throwing objects into state.
Essentially, yeah.
Okay, how do we, well, is it relevant to talk about how we get rid of objects from state right now?
You could reset. You could reset to like an empty array potentially, or an empty string in the case of hello. If you had like a reset function.
Like, do you ever like erase state or remove objects?
No, not really. Not typically. Yeah. Good question though. Absolutely. Cool. So we've got data. Now let's do something with it. Let's do something interesting and meaningful. So our let's check our objectives here. So we want to use a list component to dynamically render content. We kind of faked that well, we didn't fake it, but we had sort of a more arbitrary example, right, where we had some hard-coded array. We had a hard-coded array here for our sentences, for our paragraphs, and we mapped through them. So now we can do something very similar with the GIFs. However, a good practice in terms of architecture and hierarchy is to create a list component that handles this mapping and handles creating individual components. So we're going to add a couple components to our hierarchy now. So I'm going to bring back our, oops, there we go. No. I'm going to bring back our file and folder structure, and let's create a new component. This is going to ultimately be just coordinating, rendering these GIFs. So I'm going to make a new file. I'm going to call it giflist.js. It's going to be a functional component. because all it's going to do is take in this array that we now have on state and do this mapping and render out individual GIF components. So I'm just going to copy what I already have in paragraph because that's a pretty simple functional component. We don't need this up here. We just need React. And let's modify this now. So we'll change paragraph to GIF list. We'll take in some props. Right now, I'm just going to have it return like an empty string. We'll just have it return a paragraph. I'll say hello from the GIF list. That'll help us identify what's going on. We don't really need a class name on this for right now. This is just basically to verify that the GIF list is working. And let's go back into app.js now. What's the next step if we want to be able to render it in app.js? Import it. Very nice. So we'll go into our section where we're importing components. I'm just going to copy this line and change paragraph to GIF list. So that should give us the GIF list component. It's grayed out on my text editor right now because we're not using it or rendering it yet. And let's just go ahead and throw it right in the middle here. So we'll do GIF list. Right now it's not receiving any props or doing anything special. We just want to see it rendering out in the DOM. So once you have that, go back to your app. You may have to do a hard refresh. And cool. Hello from the GIF list. Nice. So components working, setups working. We have this available. Now let's make it do something smart for us. So there's a few things we need to do. We want to move some of this logic. Well, I'm going to leave this here as an example of how to do the mapping. But we talked about how we can split up state, right? And that's kind of part of the idea is we load all this data in app.js, and that's the heart or the brain of our entire application. And then we just pass pieces of it around to whatever needs it. So let's add to our hierarchy now. We've got header, we've got paragraph. I'll move that over there. And let's add another component in here. Let's add in the GIF list. So we've got this component, create a connection to it because it's a direct child of app.js. And app.js now has state, right? App.js is sort of in charge of the state of the application. So we draw a little connection here. This is not an actual component. This is just state. This is where our data lives. This is where our GIFs live in terms of the relevant data for us today. And so app is going to pass part of that state because we have what? We have content, title, GIFs. It's going to just pass the GIFs to the GIF list. So how can I do that? Yeah, through a prop. And I think I'm just going to call it GIFs equals. Yeah. Cool. And now inside the GIF list, we can leave it just returning this paragraph for right now, just to ensure things are working. It's already set up to receive props, so let's just throw a quick log of props in there and see if it's receiving it properly, correctly. Do refresh. Whoops. Cool. So we're seeing a couple logs here. GIF list. Well, let me blow this up a little bit. So at first, on first load, right? Because our components are mounting once, then the asynchronous fetch request is going out. Then when it comes back, state changes, so that triggers a re-render. So our first render of the GIF list logs its props, and GIFs is an array of 0 because we just initialized it as an empty array in app.js, right? So then the data comes back, state gets set with our actual array of objects, and then we see another log from the GIF list that actually has the array of objects in there. So everything is working right so far. Now, what I'd like you to take a shot at, and we'll do like a solid 5 to 10 minutes on this, is see if you can, well, actually before we do that, we need to add one more thing. GIF list is going to be a very simple component that just does some mapping through the list, through the GIFs, excuse me, and then renders out a bunch of single GIF components. Sort of like very similar to what we're doing here with paragraphs, right? We're mapping through an array and we're returning a actual component. We're replacing our data with actual components. So we're going to pass the array to GIF list. We've got that wired up. GIF list is then going to map and return a bunch of single GIF components. So we need to add to our hierarchy GIF list, which is receiving part of state through props. GIF list itself, well, I'll just copy this one, is going to be rendering a child component that we'll just call GIF. And this component is what will contain the actual JSX or HTML of like an image with the source set as the GIF, the GIF URL. So that's our hierarchy for right now. And let's make that happen. So we'll make another file. I'm just going to call this one gif.js. And again, we just want to kind of start from a basic functional component. So we'll copy what we have in GIF list, paste it in here, change the names. We'll just say hello from the GIF component. For right now, I'm going to get rid of this particular console log of props. And in fact, let me get rid of the console log in header. Yeah, header. It's just so we clean up our console a little bit, because we know that those components are working. And if we look at our hierarchy now, so we need to import GIF somewhere, but where are we going to do that now? So far, we've only been doing it in app.js. If we want the GIF list to be able to render GIF components, yeah, exactly. Very nice. We need to import it into the GIF list here. So I'm going to make a little space. We'll import GIF. Oh, I'm in GIF. Yes, thank you. Sorry. We'll go to the GIF list, make a little space here, and we'll import GIF from ./GIF, because we're already inside the components folder. And we'll make a little note, import GIF component so it can be rendered here. Cool. So app.js is rendering the list. App.js renders the list renders individual GIFs. Sweet. And let's go back to our page. Actually, it's not in the render of the GIF list. So now instead of hello from the GIF list, let's just return the actual GIF component. Whoops, capitalized. And now we should see hello from GIF over on our app. Oh, yeah, there it is. Hello from the GIF component. Yeah, there we go. Sweet. So we've kind of worked on the architecture. We've got it wired up the way we want. And this is really a best practice for any time you're dealing with lists. You have like a list component that coordinates rendering single components. There's a lot of benefits to doing it that way that we can talk about. So your task now, and as I said, I'm going to give you like a solid chunk of time for this. You can use sort of the template of how we did things with paragraphs to map through the array and return individual components, basically, with the data pumped in. So use this as sort of like a template and see if you can get your GIF list component to return a whole bunch of GIFs based on the data that the GIF is receiving. So GIF list is receiving a whole bunch of data, well, not that much, but an array of 10 GIF objects. So you'll need to write some logic in here to map through that array and turn it into individual GIF components. And then the return for here will just be all those components. Is it clear what I'm asking you to do? Do you have questions on what I'm asking for? It's kind of a little tricky to explain. Yes?
To actually have the GIF display
Yeah, ultimately we want the actual GIFs displaying on the page. And so your GIF component will need to be modified to not be a paragraph. It'll probably be like an image. And your GIF list component will need to be modified to do the mapping and return a bunch of GIF components. Feel like taking a crack at it? It's okay if you don't get all the way there. Let's do 7 minutes, and we can add on more time if needed. And like if you like, feel free to work with each other. Raise your hand if you're stuck. All right, we're about at time here. That was a big ask that I just made, so let's come back together and construct it step by step. Who feels like they made some progress and can help me get going here? A little progress, all right. That counts for a lot. So if ultimately what we want is to get our GIFs actually rendering on the page, where should we start? Okay, so we've got them loaded up after the component mounts.
So you want to pass them down first to the higher parent?
Yes, it's cool. So we're passing, I actually think I have that set up. So right here, passing the GIF list, the GIFs from state. So, yep. Like so, like GIFs equals props.gifs. Okay.
That's where I mapped. But
inside of GIF or inside of here?
Inside of GIF list,
yeah. Yeah, okay, cool. Let's. Nice. I love it. That's where I'm trying to go to. So let's set up that map. So what should I start with?
Well, I just did return. I did it all in one line. Props.gif.map.
So we're mapping through this array of GIFs.
Yeah. And I did GIF.
Yep. Well,
And then I did my component call. GIF. And then GIF prop.
GIF prop.
And then curly brackets, GIF.GIF URL. The prop then passing to GIF.
Nice. Cool. Sweet. I'm going to modify this a little bit just because I think it will be a little clearer what's going on. So I'm going to declare another constant. By the way, that's like that. This is exactly what I'm going for. So very nice. Very nice. I'm going to declare a constant in here. I'm going to call it GIFs. Actually, I'm gonna call it GIF components because it's an array of GIF components ultimately, and we'll set that equal to the results of our map. So we're mapping through the GIFs that were passed down here from app.js right here. So we're dealing with this array of data. We're dealing with one GIF at a time. And then Eldon's used this implicit return from the fat arrow. I'm just going to break it out for anyone who's not familiar with that syntax. So map is a function that returns, let's space this a little better, is a function that we need to return something. In this case, we're returning a component with data from just one of these GIF objects at a time passed to it. If we were to throw like a console log of GIF in here, and let's label it GIF from map. Let's see what we get here. And for this return, for right now, I'm just going to return GIF components. So let's check that out in the app. Should see a bunch of, oh, broke the hell out of it. Objects are not valid as a React child. Found object with keys GIF components. Collection of children. Oh. GIF list line 40. Line 40? Oh. In the div. Well, it doesn't like something that we're doing here. And it may be because of the asynchronous nature of what we're trying to do. I'm going to cut this out and just return an empty string for right now. I just want to see, I want to get into this map function. Still doesn't like it. What?
I had to put my gift components and
Oh, good call. Let's try that. By the way, if you're using VS Code and you click on this little thing down here, it says JavaScript, and start typing in React, you get nice code completion in React. So if we start typing div now, we can actually get it rendering. I think you are right. Let's try that. Cool. Let's try that now. Cool. So we're not getting anything on the page yet, but I want to show what we're dealing with at each point in the map. So we're mapping through the GIFs array passed to this component through props. We're dealing with a single GIF at a time, which means we're dealing with a single one of these objects at a time. So we have a description and we have a GIF URL. This is the core thing that we want so that we can actually render some stuff on the page. So I just wanted to show what was happening inside of that map. And instead of now returning an empty string, let's actually return our GIF. Whoops, okay, I lost it. Let's actually return our GIF component with the relevant stuff passed to it. So I'm going to just shadow the way it's called in the API. So I'm going to do GIF URL equals GIF to refer to the object in the map dot GIF URL. So now this GIF component is set up to receive a GIF URL. Right now, that component is not doing much, right? It just says hello from the GIF component. Let's see what we get on the page now. Cool. So we're actually getting stuff rendering. Zoom this out. Actually, let's clear the console. We're getting stuff rendering. So our map is working. We're seeing 10 logs of hello from the GIF component. So we're well on our way, right? And this GIF component is now receiving, as a prop, a GIF URL. So from within GIF, we can do something like const GIF URL equals props.GIF URL, right? That might be unnecessary. I mean, it is unnecessary, but yeah, let's not do that actually. We'll just render it right into what we want to return here. So if we want to go from just these 10 sentences being logged out to 10 actual GIFs logging out, Now we're dealing with one URL at a time. That's what we have available as props.gif URL, because that's what we called it right here in the GIF list. So rather than a paragraph tag, let's make an image, right? Change this to React. Start typing in an image tag, and now we can control the source by pumping in with our curlies to template. We can pump in the props.gif URL. And so now instead of 10 sentences being returned, we should have 10 images returned with the appropriate URL passed to them. So let's see what we get. Come on. Nothing? There we go. There they are. My computer is struggling right now because of the recording, but we have a bunch of GIFs. We did it. They're not the most well formatted in the world, but we've got them. So we created Tumblr. Which, oh yeah, it is. Yeah, well, you know, that's just like your opinion, man. I happen to love the Big Lebowski. So ultimately, where we're going to get by the end of this series is you all will have the ability within your app to post new things to this API. So all of our apps will grow with a bunch of weird, hopefully weird and funny GIFs. That's all right, so one more thing, right? We've got this, each child in an array or iterator should have a unique key. You guys remember that from last time where we were dealing with our paragraphs? So let's go ahead and basically just modify that same map function to render a unique key as well. So actually, since we now have data from an actual API, we can do, I guess we're just passing the GIF URL here. So we could use the index from the map, or since we have access to one GIF at a time, right? If we bring back our log of props.gif. Oh, no, that would have to be from within here. If we bring back that log, refresh, we now have an ID that we can use. Rather than having to use an index value, since we're getting data from an actual API with uniquely identified resources, undefined. Oh, whoops, just GIF in here. Each one of these GIF objects, in addition to having the GIF URL, also has an ID. And these are all unique, they count up. And any well-constructed API will not have IDs that repeat for the same resource. So rather than using the index, let's use the ID. So we can do key equals gif.id. And that should take care of that warning. Let's see what we get. Yep, warning's gone. Our GIFs are on the page. And we're basically in business here. So that's a lot, right? It's a lot of stuff. And we're ramping up in complexity quite a bit now, even though it's a relatively simple app. Questions on what we just did? Yeah, absolutely. It's recorded. We at the beginning tomorrow, we will break this down a little bit more as well. The key thing, if you're unsure of some of the syntax of what we did, I think the key takeaway from today is thinking about the architecture. Let's make this a little bigger. What we did, right? Our app loads. This is sort of the entry point for everything. We made this fetch request to our API. Actually, yeah, we made a fetch request to an API. We received some data. We set that on state right here. And then app is already passing some data from state to the header and paragraph. But what we did today is we passed through props this array of GIFs to the GIF list right here. And then the GIF list mapped through that array and passed just a single URL to each GIF component. So we ended up with 10 GIF components. we've got this top-down data flow nicely. And if we had other components depending on the GIF list, or like that GIF array, they could also render based on it. Yeah, Michael.
Can you clarify whether it's the render or the return that needs one parent component?
Whether it's the render or the return for...
Along the way, we're getting the object pair. Is it the ultimate render that needs to be under one parent?
Oh,
Or
yeah, so your return statements, so return statement in a functional component is like the render function of a class component. So whatever you're returning, whether it's in a render function or in a functional component, needs to be wrapped in like a single container element. So that's why I was really upset when we were just trying to render these GIF components without having them wrapped in a div. So anytime you're returning something, this doesn't need a container because it's just one element. But if you're returning a number of elements, like a block of code, basically like this, they need to be wrapped in a container so that the return can work properly. Otherwise, it gets confused, basically. Yeah. Good question. Destructuring? Yeah, so we'll probably do some refactoring when we're done with this app and implement some nice features like destructuring. Initially, I think that makes things more confusing. The bottom line is if we're passing a bunch of props, we can destructure the props object and pull just the individual pieces out of it. For right now, I'm just calling everything props. So props will contain potentially a bunch of things. But yeah, we'll get to that for sure. Sweet. All right, if you have more questions, please read the resources also. The documentation is good. They dive into list components and keys. And yeah, come ready again tomorrow to write some more code and with some questions. Because we'll start off tomorrow, we'll recap what we did today and answer any lingering questions. Yeah. Yeah, that's the plan. Yeah, it's not an event day tomorrow, so we'll do... Yeah, sweet. All right, awesome. Thank you all so much for your time.
Thank you.